Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is the Intelligence Squared podcast, How AI is Changing Warfare. And we are live from the Web Summit here in Lisbon, and I am your host, Adam McCauley. So this week at the summit, we've explored the near endless frontier of technological development, from robots folding laundry to advanced applications that leverage artificial intelligence to improve personal and professional life. Conversations and presentations this week have also taken us to the intersection of technology and politics. Recognition that the way technologies are used has profound societal and social implications. Which brings us to our discussion today, AI and its influence in warfare. We live in interesting and uncertain times, and in our so-called moment of increasing geopolitical and great power competition, has emerged, or this era has emerged in parallel with the rise in rhetoric around transformational artificial intelligence. In this context, the pursuit of world-changing AI capabilities has increasingly been viewed through the military and political lens, fueling a narrative that posits that the winner of this next great arms race, as it were, may just rule this world. But the heart of this puzzle is actually how AI technology collides with human institutions and the decision makers in those institutions to understand how these tools already influence how we see, understand, and act in the world. So today, I'm delighted to be joined by my panelists. To my right, Kenneth Cukier is the Deputy Executive Editor at The Economist and a New York Times bestselling author of books on technology and society, including Big Data, a revolution that will transform how we work, live, and think, and Framers, Human Advantage in the Age of AI. To his right, I have the honor of welcoming Agnès Callamard, the Secretary General of Amnesty International and a lifelong human rights advocate. She is the former UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial arbitrary killings, the former Executive Director of the organization Article 19, and the former Director of Global Freedom of Expression at Columbia University in New York. And it's a pleasure to have you both here today. So I'm going to open this up initially. I think the purpose of a conversation like this is to ground such a big and profound topic in the world as we see it. So to our panelists, and maybe Agnès first, I wonder if you can take us into the story of AI as it's unfolding, perhaps in Ukraine or the Middle East, as it were.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to participate to a superbly important discussion. So I think the war in Ukraine has confirmed the transformation of warfare caused by drones, and I'm going to focus on the use of drones in particular, demonstrating that the war of the future will be about maximum drones and minimum humans, but not the victims, of course. The victims will remain humans. So I worked on drones when I was a special rapporteur, and I warned against the proliferation of drones then. It was 5 years ago. Since then, we have seen an acceleration of the use of drones, more and more sophisticated, including swarming drones, which will move towards lethal swarming drones. We know from what we are hearing about the situation in Ukraine that it is not because you're using drones that you are not targeting civilians and that you are not targeting civilian infrastructures. And I think we need to remember constantly, as we are dealing with the artificial intelligence, we need to recall what are wars for and what is in the nature of war. And we need to recall that the vast majority of wars have not been only fought on and through the bodies of soldiers, they have been fought predominantly through the bodies of civilians, men, women, and children who had nothing to do with the conduct of warfare. We need to remember that wars over the years of our so-called human civilization have been directed at exterminating people because of their ethnicity, because of their race, because of their political dissident, and a range of other ethnic markers. And we need to remember that artificial intelligence will make that kind of war more effective. It will not make it more human. It will not make it, well, it may make it more deliberate and it may make it more accurate, but not in terms of targeting what could be described as lawful target. It will make it more accurate in terms of targeting who has been targeted over the vast numbers of years of warfare in our human civilization. So let not be fooled by those who are going to tell you, oh, but through artificial intelligence, we will be more accurate. Accurate for what? Let's not ever forget what are war for. And they are not about soldiers only. World War I was a vast exception to our human history. So drones in Ukraine demonstrate that. Drones in Libya demonstrated that. And the use of facial recognition in Gaza are the clear demonstration of how artificial intelligence is being used so-called to target individuals on the basis of a set of data which are very problematic and which are not transparent and for which there is very little accountability. So we are extremely, at Amnesty International, concerned with those developments, the one that we are aware of. I have attended a number of conferences for the last year which are demonstrating to me that armies around the world, military thinkers around the world, are focusing on Ukraine and Gaza at the moment as a way of learning what the next wars are going to be.
So Agnes, thank you for that. And it's an important reminder that perhaps the nature of war hasn't changed. But what we're here to talk about perhaps is how the character of war has changed. And on that, I'd love to bring in Kenneth just to get your observations about what technological advancements, especially when they're applied in this space, look like. What do you think about? What should we be thinking and talking about perhaps in the context of an event like this?
Sure. So let's all first agree that war is heinous and we should devote all of our energies to avoiding war. And that's not a platitude for those of us whose very families have lived through the bloodlust and the terrible destruction of World War II. And in Europe, wars in Europe and anywhere in the world, they know that in their DNA, and I know I do. So if we are going to have war, it is just a fact of life that militaries are going to try to get a technical advantage among others. And AI is the next iteration of that. The doctrine of the Pentagon is that there should be a human on the loop or a human in the loop. And they use both terms, which suggests to me that there's not only just a vagueness there, that it's actually probably a short-lived doctrine. Because if you think about how the technology of AI works, the whole purpose is to replace human cognition in the same way that you don't have a PhD in librarian science look at every single Google query and accept it and then serve it up to the person who actually made that request. So to the idea that you're always going to have a human in the loop in a case of lethality doesn't make much sense. So then the question becomes, how can we constrain or channel these technologies so that it is effective in the way that the military officers believe it needs to be effective, while also minimizes the casualties or the unintended consequences of it that don't give you a military advantage. I actually agree 100% with Agnes that the shift that actually is a recent one of the last 100 years, 150 years, in which war went from being military to military to military to civilian, is one that we should try to eradicate. And in a very disgusting way, you actually would prefer a world in which militaries are fighting militaries and they're not bombing civilian populations for obvious reasons. But if you think about it to the second order effect still, we will go to a world in which it'll be M-to-M combat, which is not military to military, but machine to machine combat. And that then becomes a little bit more interesting because first it will avoid the bloodshed that is so horrific for both sides. But also, you could, if you're going to have a conflict, at least it will be one that will be it could have the potential to be more humane. And although that sounds somewhat absurd, let us remember that over the last 150 years, we've been creating the Geneva Protocols in all of its different iterations so that there could be something of the laws of war. And indeed, look at conflicts, whether it is Vietnam or Afghanistan, Iraq, or now in the Ukraine, and the use of chemical and biological weapons and nuclear weapons have not been used. Chemical weapons have been used in Syria, sadly against in a civil war. But it is to say that there is a modicum of restraint that is being applied in the case of Ukraine. It is not all-out war. That gives us short succor, if you will, because the point is that the nature of war is changing. It is hitting the Moore's Law moment, and we are going to have a digitization of all weaponry, and things that are big, like tanks and planes, can be brought down by things that are small, like drones, and that's going to change the nature of militaries, procurement, what it means to be a soldier, and the nature of conflict itself.
I mean, as you can see, the implications of something like this are wide-ranging, but it poses a challenge for most of us in trying to understand what the implications of these changes look like. So perhaps the metaphor that's useful in this context is to think about it in terms of both hardware and software. You know, Agnès' example here of the use of drones or the proliferation of drones and how those drones navigate the world that they encounter is in some ways a function of the hardware innovations that we've seen in technology. But there's an important software aspect of this, and I mean this software in kind of a wider sense. The ways in which we, as humans within institutions, with developed processes, try and make sense of what these tools enable, what they allow us to see, how they shape what we see, and where we find ourselves still, hopefully, with meaningful control over how they're used. In this case, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish, and I think here Agnès would have a lot to say in terms of the use of, let's say, algorithms or machine learning programs in terms of targeting or identifying potential targets, what that means. This gets us into a very wide-ranging conversation on things like distinction and proportionality in conflict, perhaps something we wouldn't have time to talk about today in full. But the idea here is that there's something important, not necessarily about what militaries are doing, but how they're doing it, and whether or not they're doing it with the same due regard, whether or not the moral and ethical implications and responsibilities are clear enough for those that hold this power. But I'd love, starting with Agnès anyway, to maybe unpack some of the more tangible examples of the way in which we see these tools being deployed in the world and what the implications, at least at first glance, appear to be.
Thank you very much. Well, we have seen the use of those so-called precise, targeted killings throughout the world ever since the beginning of the war against terrorism. I would like to highlight a few things. First, yes, the direct target may have been someone who was, who may have been a criminal in quotation mark. That does not make their deliberate killing lawful, particularly if there is no war being declared or no war being waged. So for the last 20 or some years, we have seen the use of deliberate targeting of individuals through the use of drones extraterritorially in cases and in situations where there were no wars. This is completely unlawful. So point number one. Point number two, the question of accuracy of those weapons is largely open to question, in fact. For most of us monitoring these weapons, what we have found is that they are, in fact, less accurate than other more mainstream weapons that are being used. We have seen a very large number of civilians, people killed in so-called collateral damage. We have seen many mistakes because the data upon which the targeted killing and the drones are not accurate themselves. The targeting can only be accurate if the data is accurate, if the data is collected in real time, if there has been no changes, if the basis upon which the data is collected is good enough. If you collect data on the basis of age, gender, and occupation, you are very likely to target individuals that have committed no crimes. I will not mention the fact that constant drones on top of people's head is an enormous source of stress, mental disease, and so on and so forth. So that is the reality of drones, and we are making those weapons much more effective now. We are moving towards them becoming more autonomous, possibly even autonomous from human control, something that we at Amnesty opposed with great fervor, and luckily a large number of countries are taking a stand against lethally autonomous weapon system. That is, weapon system that can target and determine when and how to target in a completely autonomous way from any kind of human control. For us, this is an absolute red lines for a range of reasons. I could also speak about the use of facial recognition technology that has been used, for instance, in Gaza to target journalists through targeted killings, to target a large number of 15,000 possibly young men, supposedly because of their age, because of their gender, and so on. They must be affiliated with Hamas. These are just not the way we should pursue so-called military-to-military warfare.
So I'm going to bring in Kenneth here to respond.
Yeah. Agnes, let me ask a question to you. Are you opposed to AI weapons, or are you opposed to weapons?
No, I am opposed to weapons that are being used unlawfully and in violation of international law, point number one.
Okay.
And I am opposed to weapons that are being publicized and put out as so-called more accurate, when in fact the evidence put that they are not only not more accurate, they are more lethal.
So if the AI weapon is more accurate, could be, let's leave lethality to the side for a second. If the AI weapon is more accurate and there's a declaration of war, then it's fine.
No?
Okay, then
because what do we mean by accuracy?
Now you're going a layer of abstraction higher to a meta level.
To target people on the basis of their ethnicity, of the basis on their race, of the basis on their gender, which is what war has always been about, then I'm sorry, but AI-powered weapons are extremely dangerous for our entire humanity.
So I'm going to give Kenneth an opportunity to respond here.
He was
just a little
asking
bit.
me questions,
No,
so I reply.
Of course. So I question whether war is always about racial and gender-related matters. Sometimes it's about territory. It could just be about nationalist passions. But I'm worried that the conversation is moving into a direction in which we're an area that we would all agree that war is bad and regrettable. The idea that we need a declaration of war to make a conflict something somehow above the board is strange, because I don't think there's declarations of war don't happen anymore. It's a very sort of 19th century diplomatic protocol that doesn't really take place in the 21st century anymore. AI weaponry is going to be a fact of life. So the question is going to be, can we make AI weaponry more humane, as heinous as that sounds, in any way that we can define it? And one way we would probably define it is to say that the weapon should be more accurate rather than less, so it actually attacks the target and not something that was not the target. So many people probably remember one of the early leaks of WikiLeaks, of the Apache helicopter that shot up what appeared to be militants in Afghanistan, but in fact was journalists, and it thought to be an armament was actually a camera. There were children there, and you can hear the voice recordings of the individuals saying, well, that's what happens when you bring a child into the theater of war. Never occurring to the people that actually this was a complete misidentification and a tragedy is taking place. In a situation like that, you can sort of conceptually think, what would happen if there was a little AI sentinel we'll call it a co-commander, that is watching what's going on. The humans are still making the decisions, and they can exercise mercy. They have to have some form of judgment. They have moral responsibility. But it can say, check this. Take a second. Take a beat and consider this might be a mistaken identity. You could imagine that the pixels of the camera, being better than the human eye, will say, hey, this is a camera. This is not a Kalashnikov. You could even imagine facial recognition saying, whoa, this is a member of the press. We have him accredited. He goes to our briefings. This is not a militant. He might be with militants, but it looks like, no, these are civilians. These are civilians. Back off. Stand down. That, I think a lot of us would say, hey, that is, if we're going to have the regrettable environment of war, that is something that we probably want to have to reduce the casualties of war.
So I'm gonna jump off Kenneth's point and give Agnes a chance to respond here, because I think the question is that if there's an inevitability to conflict, right? If it is in some important but unhelpful way ingrained in the way we as human societies engage each other, the idea that we could do this with greater accuracy does seem to offer some degree of hope. I think you're about to tell us, however, how, let's say, the models in their present form and the use of facial recognition in the present day may provide counter arguments and evidence to that. But I wonder if you could speak to the specifics of what we've found, where we see these types of technologies deployed, the degree to which it helps us gain a sense of how much we can know about an environment as war is that is preternaturally uncertain.
Well, I can tell you that outside war, facial recognition technology has been used disproportionately against racialized communities, against poor people, and there is absolutely no evidence of facial recognition technology in general inherently not violating the right to privacy. You know, if you're talking about the one that is most in use right now, it is predicated on the scrapping of millions, trillions of data of your faces. I'm sure this is happening as we speak. You have not given them your authorization. This is how the technology is being developed. So it is inherently a violation of human rights by design, by the way it's being created, by the way it's being applied. Every implementation that we at Amnesty International have monitored has highlighted the racial dimension of its implementation, the unlawful use of the technology to back unlawful use of force, and so on and so forth. We have documented the use of the technology in occupied territories of the West Bank and of Gaza, and in all those cases we have seen that it is being used to violate the rights of Palestinians, including freedom of movement in the West Bank, and it is currently used in Gaza to violate the right to life of individuals that are being targeted simply because they are men of a certain age and therefore seemingly being associated with a so-called terrorist group. There is nothing about facial recognition technology that can be made to respect human rights, because by their very design, this is not respectful of human rights. So these massive surveillance technology for Amnesty International are opening the door to vast human rights violations. Now, you know, the accuracy issue, the ability to pick one individual on the basis of their face, notwithstanding the question that has been raised repeatedly about the accuracy. I'm again coming back to the nature of war. I mean, yes, in an ideal world, we could have machine against machine. Where right now in the world, where do we have such wars? In the future, even in Russia, Ukraine, which is probably the most technologically advanced so-called war, we have Ukrainians dying every day, civilians being killed every day. So, you know, wars may be waged for territories. So what does it mean? You're not going to kill the civilians that are on those territories? Of course you're going to do that. this is what is we unless we change human nature, which is highly unlikely, to put this weapon in the hands of our humanity is to kill the humanity.
We're already killing humanity with our wars. So the question is, if we have a technology that is going to operate far quicker than at human speed, that will have unknown effects at the outer edge of its abilities, will actually be able to play the game of strategy more complex and far, not just faster, but far longer out than we do. In the same way, if we were to play a game of chess, a grandmaster can think maybe 5 moves out of all the different pieces, but if this can play 50 moves out, it gets a farther advantage out into the future. If we're going to have these tools, and of course I've not even mentioned the lethality will be vastly larger, although actually AI doesn't change the lethality is a different question. AI simply changes the delivery of when, where, and how of that lethality. If we're going to have that,
if a drone can carry mass weapons, it does make a difference.
It's still a piece of infrastructure. It's flying. Whether it flies because a human operator brings it there or AI brings it there, it's flying and it drops its payload.
Except that there are some
the point is that if we are going to have these,
that have drones now.
Yes, there's many. There's going to be 200 next year. There's going to be 300 the year after that.
They don't have super big planes.
I beg your pardon. The broader point is that if we are going to have these weapons, then we're going to have to find a way to govern them responsibly, knowing that in some ways, in a weird way, they're smarter than we are. They do things better, faster, etc., than more complicated than we do. So what are those rules? Because I think that simply saying war is bad brings us into a dead end, because we are still going to have war, yet we're going to have war that is going to have AI weaponry, and we are going to be unprepared for managing it. Now, I am certain that a human in the loop can't be the total answer of that, because, of course, the communications won't always be there. You'll still have what's called loitering munition. It will still see a piece of infrastructure or a person, a uniformed soldier, that it's on its target list, and it'll want to swoop down and take action against it. A euphemism, it'll want to kill it or blow it up. No euphemisms. Let's talk about the real thing. So if we were going to have this heightened capability, and our adversary is creating weapons as well, and we feel the need, because it would be irresponsible not to match that capability so that we can have a parity of force, hopefully to avoid conflict, we're now in a conundrum. And the conundrum is, we don't have a doctrine with which to understand AI weaponry, and it looks very different than what happened in the 20th century with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were big, it required a state to make. They were big, and therefore they were visible. And the first thing you did in a nuclear arms negotiation treaty is you counted, and you said, I'll show you mine if you show me yours, and you saw the megatonnage, and then you started talking about, well, what form of megatonnage, what is the distance, how long does it take, and how many do you have, and you start trying to limit them. By disclosing your capability, you can actually try to temper down the threat of war. But with AI, it's different. It's invisible. It's created on software. It's created on people's laptops as a model, and then it's used in a data center. And to disclose your capability is to give away an advantage, unlike in the nuclear arms negotiation world. So how do we respond to a world of AI weaponry, knowing that we're going to need to match our adversary because we don't want to become a victim of them? We're seeing a victim and an aggressor in the Ukraine war as an example. So we are in a conundrum. I'll flip it to Adam, because you've been thinking about this for a long time. What could a doctrine look like for an age of AI war?